It's time again for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show, in regards to the Star Trek CCG, I'm responding to a couple comments from viewers who wanted to see an episode that showed the do's and don'ts of deck building in this game. Now, I've alluded on previous episodes in this series about tips and tricks for building a deck, but I'm going to use my Federation deck as an example of what not to do when building a deck for the Star Trek CCG. Let's get started, shall we? Now, there are many facets to making a deck for the Star Trek CCG, and I've said time and time again that you really have to be careful what you're doing when you're constructing a deck. First and foremost, when you start a deck, you have to choose the affiliation you're going to play as. That is the biggest thing, and when you're choosing the affiliation, you really have to think about the missions you're choosing for your affiliation. These two go hand in hand when you're building a deck. I only have 4 of my missions out from my deck here, but each of the missions I've chosen for this deck specifically work towards the strengths of the characters in my affiliation, or in this case, the personnel cards. Most of them have the skills needed to complete the mission successfully, etc., etc. You don't just slap together any missions with a Federation icon for a Federation affiliation. It doesn't work that way. These are the first 2 things you're going to figure out when building a deck. And one of the common mistakes that a lot of players make is, after they've chosen their affiliation and put some personnel together, that's where the thinking ends when it comes to missions. They just grab any affiliated missions that, oh, that's Federation, those go with my deck, and that's it. Wow, that's not good at all. Furthermore, when you move on to ships, you want to choose ships again that work with your personnel. For example, my USS Enterprise E I have in my deck because I have these staffing icons from the first contact iterations of the crew, which would be the bridge crew Picard, Riker, Troy, Geordi, etc. So they work with that ship. I have some DS9 crew as well as some crew suited for the Defiant, and most of them are command icon. And my Enterprise D is my third and what I call my backup ship, because it will work with pretty much any Federation personnel providing I have those staffing icons. The range is also very good on these ships, going from 8 to 9 to 10. I'm not going to use any ship that has any less of a range than 8 in my deck. After you've got your affiliation and your missions and your ships sorted, one of the common mistakes that people make is not having enough equipment in their deck to sustain their personnel cards. Now, I've never been a big proponent of having a shit ton of equipment, but I like to have a certain amount of equipment cards that work well with my crew. And I'm just showing a selection here. What I like to use in this deck are Type 3 phaser rifles, engineering kits, and occasionally some tricorders, and maybe 1 medical tricorder in a side deck if I'm feeling so inclined. Again, the equipment needs to go hand in hand with your personnel to help you complete missions or deal with away team issues. So that has to be the next step after those 3. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when constructing a deck for this game, and I have to use my friend Josh again as an example. Sorry, Josh, but you used to do this hard back in the day. They put together their side deck before they put together the rest of the draw deck. I'd never understood that. That's kind of backwards. The side deck should be the last thing you do, especially if you're using a Q's tent or a battle bridge. You're not going to know what your deck is capable of until after it's built. The side deck should be as an addendum. It should be the last thing you put together. If you're using a Q10, it's going to have those last few power and awesome cards or extra personnel you're going to bring out under dire circumstances. Another big mistake is the dilemma pile. As I've said, between 20 and 28 dilemmas are fine for a deck, but your dilemmas should go hand in hand with each other. You should have 2 or 3 dilemmas for each mission you put under that work well with each other to stymie your opponent. You just don't pick random dilemmas and shove them under there and hope for the best. You want a good 1, 2, 3 combo of dilemmas to hamper your opponent so bad that he can't complete the mission. That is the whole point of dilemmas cards. You don't want him to score points, man. Come on. Finally, one of the last big mistakes is a lot of players don't vary their cards in their deck. And I'm talking about power cards such as events, artifacts, and interrupts. Some players are way too heavy on events. Some players have a lot of useless artifacts that really don't go with the deck because they haven't thought it through. And a lot of players have too many interrupts that they're not able to get out. When I build a deck, I have what is called the 60-30-10 rule. 60% events, 30% interrupts, and 10% artifacts. That is the happy medium that I've found. I'm not saying that's a rule that everybody should use, but it's worked well for me and my decks. And remember, you also have a side deck. You can put extra artifacts in there too if you want a bit more than 10%. This is a guideline. It is not set in stone, but this is what I consider when I'm building a deck for the Star Trek CCG. Now, that all being said, no two decks in the Star Trek CCG are the same. Different affiliations have different pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. You have to sort that out when you're building a deck. My Borg deck, for example, as I've mentioned on previous episodes, is a power kick everyone's ass deck. So in terms of building a deck for this, I don't adhere to my 60-30-10 rule as much, and I have more personnel and less equipment, because when you're Borg, you don't need a whole lot of equipment, save for some key cards that will also go in the side deck, which is the last thing that you do. So as you see, there is a reason for everything I do when building a deck. There's a method to my madness, and the main point I'm trying to get across to any player is to consider this before you start building a deck. That's all for today. Have a great day, everybody.